MOvember, day 18, and tonight I'm going to read from an article that Pete Walker wrote. It's available on his website for free, called Grieving and Complex Post-Traumatic Stress. I saw grief drinking a cup of sorrow and called out, "It tastes sweet, doesn't it?" "You have caught me," grief answered, "and you've ruined my business. How can I sell sorrow when you know it's a blessing?" And that's by Rumi. This article explores the role of grieving and treating childhood trauma and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Insight, as crucially important as it is never enough in recovery. No amount of intention or epiphany can bypass one's need to learn to lovingly care for himself when he is suffering from the emotional flashbacks of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Emotional flashbacks are regressions that take the survivor back to the excruciating states of fear, humiliation, abandonment, helplessness, and hopelessness that he clearly drowned in during childhood. Grieving is an irreplaceable tool for metabolizing and resolving the overwhelming feelings that arise during emotional flashbacks. Grieving aids the survivor immeasurably to work through the innumerable death-like experiences of being lost and trapped in emotional flashbacks. Grieving also supports recovery in the many painful death-like losses caused by childhood traumatization. Recoverees need to grieve the death of safety and belonging in their own childhoods and the death of their early attachment needs. They need to mourn the myriad heartbreaks of their frustrated attempts to win approval and affections from their parents. As the grieving process therapeutically evolves, survivors typically uncover a great deal of unresolved grief about the deadening absence of the nurturance they needed to develop and thrive. Children will only flourish if the following types of needs are consistently met. 1. Physical needs for affection and protection. 2. Emotional needs for caring, regard and interest. 3. Spiritual needs for recognition of their worth and basic goodness. And 4. Verbal needs for welcoming inquiry, positive feedback, and multi-dimensional conversation. It is difficult to become motivated to grieve losses that occurred so long ago. Many of these losses seem so nebulous that trying to embrace grieving is a bit like trying to embrace dental work. Who wants to go to the dentist? But who doesn't go once the toothache becomes acute? Soul ache is considerably harder to assign to the losses of childhood, yet those who take the grieving journey described below come to know unquestionably that the core of their soul ache and psychological suffering is in the unworked through losses of growing up with abandoning parents. These losses must be grieved until the individual really get that their parents were not her allies. She needs to grieve until she stops blaming herself for their abuse and or neglect, until she finally realizes that their execrable parenting caused her post-traumatic stress. She needs to grieve until she understands how her learned habit of automatic self-abandonment is a reenactment of their abject failure to be there for her. Mourning these awful realities can empower her efforts to develop a multidimensional practice of self-care. As she grieves more efficaciously, her capacity for self-compassion and self-protection grows, and her psyche becomes increasingly user-friendly. Grieving ameliorates flashbacks. Pain is excess energy crying out for release. Gerald Hurd. Grieving sometimes seems sacramental to me in its ability to move me out of the abandonment melange. The abandonment melange is the extremely painful and upsetting amalgam of fear, shame, and depression that is at the emotional core of most flashbacks. A survivor can learn to grieve himself out of fear, the death of feeling safe. He can learn to grieve himself out of shame, the death of feeling worthy. And he can learn to grieve himself out of depression, the death of feeling fully alive. With sufficient grieving, the individual gets that she was innocent and imminently lovable. As she mourns the bad luck of not being born into loving parents, she can find within herself a fierce, unshakable self-allegiance. She can become ready, willing, and able to be there for herself no matter what she is experiencing, internally or externally. The inner critic, hindrances to grieving. Let us first look at the greatest hindrance of effective grieving, the inner critic. When the critic is especially toxic, grieving may be counterproductive and contradicted in early recovery. And I'm going to say that a word just out of respect to Pete. Contraindicated. Oh, Lord. I love you, Pete. I get messed up on your words sometimes. Another one for me to look up. In early recovery. Those who repeatedly pathologise and punish for emoting in childhood may experience grieving as exacerbating their flashbacks rather than relieving them. My article, Shrinking the Inner Critic, identifies 13 common inner critic programs. These programs generally constellate around self-hate engendering demands for perfection and panic-inducing misperceptions of endangerment. This article also described 13 sets of thought corrections to deconstruct these programs. I have worked with numerous clients whose tears immediately triggered them into toxic shame. Their own potentially soothing tears elicited terrible self-attacks. I'm so pathetic, no wonder nobody can stand me. God, I'm so unlovable when I snivel like this. I fuck up and then make myself more of a loser by whining about it. What good is crying for yourself? It only makes you weaker. This latter response is particularly ironic, for once grieving is protected from the critic, nothing can restore the individual's inner strength and coping capacity like a good cry. I have diffused active suicidality on dozens of occasions by simply eliciting the client's tears. On thousands of occasions, I have led clients out of flashbacks by helping them cry. Critic management is often the primary work of early stage recovery. Once the critic has been sufficiently diminished, and once thought correction techniques have made the psyche more user-friendly, the individual begins to tap into grief's sweet, relief-granting potential. She learns to grieve in a way that promotes and enhances compassion for the abandoned child she was and for the survivor she is today, still frequently struggling in the throes of flashbacks. Defueling the critic through grieving. Fear drives the toxic inner critic. The critic feeds off fear and flashes the survivor back to the frightening times of childhood. He gets stuck seeing himself only through his parents' contemptuous, intimidating, or rejecting eyes. He mirrors them and scornfully mocks himself as a defective, ugly, and unlovable. He scares himself with endangerment scenarios and abhors himself for insignificant imperfections. Because fear is a core emotional experience, emotional tools are needed to manage the fright that runs haywire during a flashback. Healthy angering and crying can short-circuit fear from morphing into the flashback triggering cognitions of the critic. I have seen grieving bring the critic's devastating programs of drasticizing and catastrophizing to a screeching halt on thousands of occasions. It appears to me that children are wired to release fear through angering and crying. The newborn baby, mourning the death of living safely and fully contained inside the mother, utters the first of many angry cries, not only to call for nurturance and attention, but also to release her fear. In the dysfunctional family, however, the traumatizing parent soon punishes the child for emoting. The child becomes afraid and ashamed of her own tears and anger. Tears get shut off and anger gets trapped inside and is eventually turned against the self as self-attack, self-hate, self-disgust, and self-rejection. Self-hate is the most grievous reenactment of parental abandonment. Over time, anger also becomes fuel for the critic and actually exacerbates fear by creating an increasingly dangerous internal environment. Anything the survivor says, thinks, feels, or imagines, or wishes for is subjected to an intimidating inner attack by the critic, which eventually morphs into the first-person voice. Why did I ask such a stupid question? Could I have an ugly expression on my face? Who am I kidding? How can an undeserving loser like me wish for love? No matter what I feel, no wonder I feel like shit. I am a piece of shit. Recovery is enhanced immeasurably by co-opting this anger from the critic and using it for self-protection and for the work of distancing from shrinking the inner critic. Let us now explore how the four processes of grieving, angering, crying, and verbally ventilating and feeling are so central to ameliorating complex post-traumatic stress. 1. Anger, diminishing fear and shame. Angering is the grieving technique of aggressively complaining about current or past losses and injustices. Survivors need to anger, sometimes rage, about the intimidation, humiliation, or neglect that was passed on to them as nurturance in their childhoods. As they become adept at grieving, they anger out of their healthy resentment at their family's pervasive lack of safety. At the 10,000 betrayals or no one to go to for guidance, protection. Sorry. I really feel like I need to read that sentence again. But at the 10,000 betrayals of no one to go to for guidance or protection, no one to appeal to for fairness or appreciative recognition of their developmental achievements. My book, The Tao of Fully Feeling, Harvesting Forgiveness Out of Blame, outlines a safe process for angering out childhood pain in a way that does not hurt the individual or anyone else. Angering is therapeutic when the survivor rails against childhood trauma, and especially when she rails against its living continuance in the self-hate process of the critic. Angrily saying no or shut up to the critic, the proxy of her parents, externalizes the anger. It stops her from turning the anger on herself and allows her to revive the lost instinct of defending herself against an unjust attack. Moreover, it rescues her from toxic shame as it reverses Erik Erikson's famous quotation, "Shame is blame turned against the self. Anger redirects blame where it belongs." Angering can be done alone or in the presence of a validating witness, such as a trusted friend or therapist. Over time, the vast majority of angering needs to be done silently in the privacy of one's own psyche, as one learns to recognize and respond to the inner critic attack with self-protective, anger-empowered thought stopping. Many survivors are so identified with the critic that it becomes their whole identity. Such survivors typically need to focus on fighting off the critic until they have established the healthy egoic function of self-protection. Until then, they typically derive little benefit from practicing the more subtle techniques of critic management that are practiced in many psychodynamic and mindfulness approaches. Embracing Your Inner Critic by Stone & Stone describes many of these techniques, which can be helpful in later recovery, once the virulent totalitarian voice of the inner critic has been sufficiently quelled. Angering also serves to rescue the individual from the childlike sense of powerlessness he is flashing back to. It reminds him that he habituates the adult body and has greater capacity for self-protection than he did as a child. As such, angering serves to antidote or reduce fear. It reawakens and nurtures the instinct of self-protection. With practice, it increasingly builds a sense of both outer and inner boundaries, safety from the bullying of others and safety from the most damaging bully of all, the inner critic. Finally, angering can also empower a myriad thought corrections and substitutions needed to establish the survivor's belief in her own essential goodness and in the lovability of discriminately chosen others. Angering bolsters her for the long-term gradual process of wresting her self-image away from the critic and re-educating the psyche to make it both user and intimacy friendly. Angering helps deconstruct repetition compulsion. Until the survivor reconnects with the instinctual anger about the abusive and neglectful behaviors that his parents forbade him to complain about, he risks blindly accepting others' reenactments of these behaviors. Here is an example of this. A meek and visibly fearful client of mine suffered a devastating sexual seductions by trusted male figures on 3 occasions in her adult life. Over time, we traced these back to a childhood betrayal of a trusted uncle, an only seemingly kind caretaker of her childhood. He preyed on her loneliness and parental abandonment and gradually took seemingly appropriate physical affection, one increment at a time, into contact that became increasingly sexual. Since her healthy, angry, self-protective instinct and ability to say no was extinguished by the time she was in preschool, she was unable to protest his sexual violations. On subsequent occasions in her life, a minister, a doctor, and then a therapist exploited her via a reenactment of the original scenario. She was so lost in a flashback all 3 times that she did not protest their exploitive betrayals, but only knew how to turn her anger inward and blame and shame herself. Eventually, during our work together, she was able to engage in the angering process of grieving. After about 6 months of my witnessing and validating her angering at her various perpetrators, she came in one week glowing with pride about her success in stopping an office predator who was in the early stages of a similar seduction. This was the stage of seemingly friendly touching, unwanted pats on the back that gradually escalated into mild sexual innuendo, lingering touches on the hand and her forearm, and these were the first inappropriate advances that she had never been able to protest with previous abuses. She was thrilled, in awe of herself, and she was able to say, in the presence of another worker no less, "Please don't touch me. I don't like it when you touch me, and I don't want to be touched. I don't want you to touch me anymore." The seduction was immediately terminated. The second one is crying, the penultimate soother. In grieving, crying is the yin complementary process to the yang processing of angering. When we are hurt, we instinctually feel sad as well as mad. The newborn child, hurt by the loss of the perfect security of the womb, howls in an angry cry. As we learn to grieve effectively, we allow ourselves to mourn about the death of positive parental attention in our childhoods. We feel sorrows about the horrible reality that parental attention was typically negative and dangerous. And we cry in self-compassion that we are rarely or never appreciated and reflected as special, worthy, and easy to love. Moreover, unabashed tears stimulate the relaxation response of the parasympathetic nervous system and counterbalance the excessive sympathetic nervous system hyperarousal when we experience a flashback. And there was a piece here that says crying is often the only process that will resolve a flashback. Unashamed crying appears to cut off the critic's fuel supply of fear before it devolves into frightened and frightening thinking. This is especially true when we cry for the suffering of our childhood abandonment, as well as the lifetime of unnecessary alienation and pain that our critic has wrought upon us. Crying and self-compassion. When we greet our own tears with self-acceptance, crying awakens our developmentally arrested sense of self-compassion. Once we establish self-compassion through consistent and repeated practice, it becomes the cornerstone of an increasing sense of self-esteem. When an attitude of self-compassion becomes habitual, it can instantly antidote the self-abandonment that is so characterized in a flashback. Moreover, self-compassion creates a foundation from which we can build authentic intimacy, enhancing compassion for others. Our ability to be there for an intimate depends on our capacity to practice unwavering allegiance to ourselves. Self-compassion also naturally sustains our motivation to long, repetitive work of fortifying our internal boundaries against the critic. Excuse me. I've witnessed my own inner and outer critic wither into innocuousness hundreds of times after a good cry. On thousands of other occasions, I've seen my clients dissolve their fear, shame, and self-abandonment with the solvent of tears. A new 35-year-old client, self-identified as a macho loner, came to me fearing that 3 days of sleeplessness were about to drive him over the edge. Excuse me, guys. His thick persona of unflappability was inaccessible to him for the first time that he could remember. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I've become a total fruitcake. I've been holed up in my apartment for 3 days. I can't bear for anyone to see me. I can't even take out the garbage. I always secretly knew that deep down I was a disgusting wimp. He went on to describe how he had recently witnessed his best friend, his black Labrador dog George, get crushed by a passing car when he raced across the street in pursuit of a squirrel. It was the worst thing he had ever seen, and he was plagued and obsessed with the images of it, especially in bed at night as sleep eluded him. He had been awake for the last 96 hours, and he was sure that he was going insane. Halfway through the session, I asked him if he missed what he missed about George, and soon the floodgates opened. He sobbed and sobbed for about 10 minutes and came out of it looking like a new man. He enthusiastically said, "I haven't cried since I was 6. I can't believe how light and relaxed and peaceful I feel. This is better than a beer or any downer I've ever taken. I can tell I'm going to be okay now. I'm seeing George as he was when he was alive, not as that horrible mangled mess on the street." Crying and angering together. Crying and angering are the two key emotional tools that we have for releasing the pain of the abandonment melange. It is important to note here that most of us suffer an acculturation process that dictates that men should only emote through angering and women through crying. From an early age, boys are punished and shamed for crying, while girls are treated similarly for angering. Hence, boys become men who learn to automatically externalize their pain of their fear, shame, and depression through anger, while women do the same with tears. Such men can only be pissed off when they are scared, humiliated, or feeling down, while such women can only cry out these feelings. This typically results in a very incomplete release. Half of the hurt release process is stymied. It is as if the motion of emotion is arrested. Emotion deteriorates into stagnant and lingering mood as anger degenerates into bitter resentment and sadness into unregenerated self-pity. Without access to tears, the angerer seethes, and without access to anger, the crier whines. Without complete emoting of the hurt, the survivor, or anyone for that matter, often becomes stuck in moodiness, in painful internal vacillations between angry resentment and melancholic self-pity. How this contrasts with the healthy grieving of my 6-year-old son, who has to periodically grieve my gradual thwarting of his diminishing narcissistic entitlement. As he does, he bawls at each new age-appropriate societal rule he has to accept. He howled this afternoon about the unfairness of having to do his homework after school before he could play some more. As we climbed the 37 stairs to our home, he punctuated his crying with a flurry of angry condemnations. "I don't like you, Daddy. You're not fair. I'm not going to be your friend." I am grateful for this healthy grieving, and still somewhat amazed that I can so calmly hold it as I help him metabolize this latest loss of early childhood narcissistic privilege. By the time we get to the top of the stairs, he opens the door and genuinely peals out a guileless laugh. "Daddy, look, Pikachu fell off the table. Daddy, can we play Pokemon after I practice writing my letters?" Grieving has almost instantly delivered him from the painful loss into eager apprehension of what's fun about life and what there is to look forward to. How frequently I see my clients re-emerge into remembering their real present-time resourcefulness once they have grieved through a painful flashback. When we can both anger and cry while re-experiencing our early abandonment in a flashback, we can obtain the more complete release from the abandonment melange. Each survivor does well to assess whether his angering or crying is blocked or stultified, and to then work at recovering it. There are, of course, numerous men and women who are reverse examples of the gender polarization mentioned above. Moreover, there are many survivors in whom both angering and crying are blocked. They are also benefited inordinately by rescuing the healing balm of both anger and tears from the stultifying prohibitions of the critic. Verbal ventilation. Verbal ventilation is the third process of grieving. It helps resolve emotional flashbacks. Verbal ventilation is speaking or writing in a manner that airs out and releases painful feelings. When we let our words spring from what we feel, language is imbued with emotion, and pain can be released through what we say, think, or write. As our grieving proficiency increases, we can verbally ventilate about our losses, using shame-dissolving language to tell the story of how we were unfairly deprived, of our birthright to be welcomed into a family that cherished us. My favorite technique to enhance verbal ventilation is to encourage the client to focus on his feelings, his painful imagery, or his bodily sensations, and then to talk in an uncensored manner about whatever comes to mind. Verbal ventilation is therapeutic to the degree that a person's words are coloured by the descriptive coloured by and descriptive of the anger, sadness, fear, shame, and or depression she feels. Ventilation that is liberally punctuated with actual crying or angering is especially powerful. Verbal ventilation is a tool that can remediate brain changes that are caused by complex PTSD. Susan Vaughan's MRI research, The Talking Cure, demonstrates that emotional flashbacks create a condition whereby the emotionally orientated right brain becomes overactivated and the thinking orientated left brain becomes underactivated. This hemispheric polarization corresponds with an overwhelming reemergence of childhood pain, emotionally remembered in the memory orientated right brain, and the loss of access to the higher cognitive functions of the left brain. This temporary loss of left brain functioning explains why it is so hard for the survivor to realize that she is flashing back, or what she is flashing back to, and that she's not currently stranded in the danger, helplessness, and hopelessness of the past. Verbal ventilation at its most potent is the therapeutic process of bringing left brain cognition to intense right brain emotional activation. It fosters the recovery's ability to put words to feelings and ultimately to accurately interpret and communicate about his various feeling states. When this process is repeated sufficiently, new neural pathways grow and allow the left and right brain to work together so that the individual can actually think and feel at the same time. He heals a crucial developmental arrest and learns to think about feeling states in a way that creates healthy, helpful, appropriate responses to feelings. Responses that are respectful to him and go to whomever the feelings arise with. In his book, Emotional Intelligence, Daniel Goleman writes that this is the core trait of emotional intelligence. With continued practice, verbal ventilation coordinates the left and right hemispheres, and when the right brain is hyperactivated in flashback, the left brain is also fully engaged, as can be seen in an MRI. When the left brain is back online, the survivor can then initiate the various tasks that are helpful in successfully resolving a flashback. As with angering and crying, verbal ventilation is only effective when it is liberated from the critic's control. In early recovery, verbal ventilation can easily shift into verbal self-flagellation. Verbally ventilating from the self-attacking or drasticizing perspective of the critic is rarely effective grieving. Instead, it typically triggers or intensifies flashbacks, which in turn frequently generate self and intimacy injuring behavior. Many survivors in early recovery are unable to notice their unconscious shifts into over-identifying with the critic's point of view. When this is the case, they usually need the help of a therapist or sufficiently recovered intimate to help them recognize and neutralize the critic. Verbal ventilation is an especially transformative grieving process. It not only promotes the same type of fear release and shame dissolution as anger and crying, but also helps to expose the manifold guises of the critic's self-attack and fear arousal. Verbal ventilation also helps us to identify and communicate about needs that have long been unmet because of our childhood abandonment. This, in turn, promotes the growth of the healthy ego, and most especially its key functions of self-compassion and self-protection. Disassociation deadens the verbal ventilation. It is important to differentiate verbal ventilation from disassociative flights or fantasy or obsessive bouts of unproductive worrying. Disassociation is a defense that children develop to distract, protect themselves. Disassociation is a defense that children develop to distract, protect themselves from the overwhelming pain of their abandonment. They have to disassociate because they are not able, as unsupported children, to effectively grieve and even allow their pain into awareness. There are two types of disassociation in complex post-traumatic stress: right brain disassociation and left brain disassociation. Right brain disassociation can be seen as a classical disassociation, and as the defense most common to freeze types, see my article of the 4Fs. It is the right brain process of numbing out against intense feeling or incessant inner critic attack. Disassociation is a process of distraction, of getting lost in fantasy, fogginess, TV tiredness, or sleep. Verbally reporting from a place of self-distraction is, in fact, the opposite of verbal ventilation. Getting lost in daydream-like descriptions of improbable salvation fantasies or in the recounting of long, elaborate dreams devoid of emotional content and serious introspection are examples of this. Left brain disassociation or obsessiveness, commonly this ranges in severity from repetitively cycling through the laundry list of worries to panicky drasticizing and catastrophizing. An obsessive defense against internal pain stands us in unhelpful perservations about issues that are minimally related or unrelated to the true nature of our suffering. Here is an example of this. I can complain incessantly about the bad weather or the unfairness of the rising cost of movie tickets to distract myself from the fact that my partner's constructive feedback is continuously flashing me back into the fear and shame I felt when my mother verbally abused me at the kitchen table. Left brain disassociation can also be a process of trivialization, avoiding upsetting inner experience by over-focusing on superficial concerns. Becoming overly preoccupied with sports statistics or the lives of Hollywood celebrities are common examples of this. This is, of course, not to deny that such interests are in themselves worthwhile when they are engaged non-defensively and in moderation. Finally, left brain disassociation can also be seen as intellectualization. This is what the novelist Anne McEwen called the high-walled fortress of focused thinking. Some survivors over-rely on rationalization and loftier dialogue to protect them from the potentially messy and painful world of feeling. Even the highest levels of creative thinking deteriorate into obsessive defense when they are excessively engaged. Verbal ventilation heals abandonment. When we allow ourselves to share what is emotionally important to us, and this applies to concerns that excite and please us as well as those that frighten, hurt, or depress us, we can learn to connect with others in an authentic, meaningful, and healing way. One of the most detrimental consequences of our childhood abandonment is that it forced us to habitually hide and mute ourselves. Many survivors have come to believe that their authentic and vulnerable self-expression is as repugnant or as boring to others as it was their parents. We must repudiate and overcome this damaging legacy of the past. Verbal ventilation is a key process in establishing healthy attachment, as key to children as the tender touch, soothing voice, and welcoming facial expressions are to infants and toddlers. When we practice this form of emotionally based communication with a safe enough other, we repair the damage of not having had this need met in childhood. This in turn opens up the possibility of finally attaining the verbal emotional intimacy that is a central lifelong need for all human beings. Unfortunately, committing to this type of practice is much harder than it may sound. Authentic and vulnerable sharing can be extremely triggering and can easily flash the survivor back to experiences of being attacked, shamed, and abandoned by parents hostile or indifferent to such self-disclosure. Therapy, individual or group, may be necessary to overcome the work that these huge obstacles to revitalizing our self-obsession. Verbal ventilation and intimacy. I believe that the reciprocal verbal ventilation is the key process of intimacy in adult relationships. Sufficient practice with a safe enough other can eventually open the survivor to experiences of comforting and restorative connection with others. Experiences that can be more alleviating of loneliness than he would ever have thought possible. As deep and meaningful connection with another gradually becomes more available and frequent, he will increasingly experience amelioration of the frightful, shaming, and deadening aspects of the abandonment depression. Moreover, he will learn the emotional communication skills that help him to process and to healthily integrate the difficult emotional experiences, disappointment, disagreement, disaffection, that intimate relationships normally and periodically undergo. Finally, it is important to note here that there are some bodywork approaches to trauma that disintegrate Firstly, it is important to note here that there are some bodywork approaches to trauma that denigrate the efficiency of talk therapy, and in extreme cases decree that this all-important process be bypassed and done away with. While somatic work of some kind is often essential to our recovering processes, it alone cannot remediate the toxic critic or resuscitate the instincts of self-compassion and self-protection. A great deal of cognitive work, especially that which is empowered by verbal ventilation, is fundamental to the significant recovery of complex post-traumatic stress. With that said, we will move on to feeling, a fourth grieving process, a process that is a type of bodywork, a way of focusing on somatic experience that enables us to reclaim our ability to experience full, relaxed, and vital inhabitancy of our bodies. So 4. Feeling and passively working through grief. Feeling is the antithesis of pain. The more pain one feels, the less pain one suffers. Arthur Jenoff. Ongoing engagement in the active grieving process of anger and crying and verbal ventilation can help us to discover the fourth grieving process, feeling. Feeling is a subtler, passive process. It is best illustrated by contrasting the two concepts, emote and feel. Emoting is when we cry or anger out the energy in the inner emotional experience. Feeling, on the other hand, is the passive process of non-reactively staying present to the internal emotional experience. In complex PTSD recovery, feeling is surrendering to the internal experiences of our childhood pain while judging and resisting them, and without emoting them out. Feeling is a kinesthetic rather than cognitive experience. It is the process of bringing one's awareness out of thinking and into internal emotions, energetic states, and sensations of the body. As a grieving process, feeling involves consciously reversing the learned survival mechanism of clamping down on pain to banish it from awareness. Feeling occurs when we bring the focus of our consciousness into an emotionally or physically painful state, and when we surrender to this experience without resistance. When we relax acceptingly into a feeling, we can learn to gently absorb it into our experience. This is similar to healthy food digestion, in which a relaxed amylatory canal allows us to effectively assimilate nutrients. However, when we suppress or repress our feelings, our body typically armor and tighten all over, especially along the alimentary canals. I believe this latter type of tightening also creates the types of digestive problems that frequently co-occur with complex PTSD. Diarrhea, for instance, can sometimes be an emotional or physical response to intense danger, a fear-induced triggering of the sympathetic nervous system that triggers an immediate evacuation of the bowels. Nausea can operate similarly. The emotional-physical connection. It is important to note here that there are often a close relationship between emotion and physical sensation. Physical sensations in the body often co-occur with feelings. Moreover, sensations of tightness and tension can develop as a defense against feelings. As unexpressed feelings accumulate, a greater degree of muscular tension is necessary to keep them in check. A child who is repeatedly punished for emoting learns to be afraid of inner emotional experiences and armors the musculature of her body in an effort to hold feelings in and banish them from awareness. Holding one's breath is a further manifestation of armoring, and an especially common way of keeping feelings at bay, as breathing naturally brings awareness down into the feeling level. Deep breathing also expands and stretches various visceral muscles in ways that sometimes release feelings and leads to emoting. I know of several survivors who were so afraid of exposing their feelings to their contemptuous parents that they fainted from resolutely holding their breath. Rebirthing and Reiking therapy employ breathing techniques to help free stuck emotions. The technique of focusing one's awareness on physical sensations in the body can help us become more proficient at the practice of feeling. With enough practice, paying attention to tightness in the face, throat, heart, or belly area brings feelings into awareness where they can simply be felt through. The passive grieving process of feeling through pain perfectly complements the active processing of grieving. We benefit immeasurably from becoming equally facile with emoting out our anger, sadness, fear, shame, and depression, as with simply staying fully present to these feelings without trying to change them. Furthermore, feeling also expands our capacity to bring the emotions into awareness that need to be grieved out through active, cathartic emoting. Thus, grieving is especially profound when we can fluidly shift between feeling and emoting. Sometimes we will need to fully feel and accept the sensations of our pain, and sometimes we will want to verbally ventilate about them within a matrix of having full permission to punctuate our words and with angering and tears. So, learning to feel. As the survivor becomes more adept at angering and crying, fear of his feelings will decrease and the opportunities to learn to simply feel will present themselves. He can engage these opportunities by passively noticing and attuning to the more subtle sensations of his anger and sadness. Over time, this practice will build his ability to stay freely and passively present to these sensations of fear, shame, and depression. In early stages, this awareness will often morph into the need to actively grieve out the fear, shame, and depression, but eventually these feelings will also be digested and worked through purely with the solvent of awareness. It is important to note here that anxiety, which is often fear just below the level of awareness, can often be felt through passively. My article, Managing the Abandonment Depression, describes this practice with much greater length, and I'll certainly read that as one of my MOvember videos. An exercise in feeling. Here is an exercise to help you enhance your ability to feel and grieve through pain. Visualize yourself as time traveling back to a place in the past where you felt especially abandoned. See your adult self talking your abandoned child into your lap and comforting her in various painful emotional states or situations. You can comfort her verbally. I feel such sorrow that you were so abandoned and that you felt so alone so much of the time. I love you even more when you are stuck in this abandonment pain, especially because you had to endure it for so long with no one to comfort you. That shouldn't have happened to you. It shouldn't have happened to any child. Let me comfort you and hold you. You don't have to rush to get over it. It is not your fault. You didn't cause it, and you're not to blame. You don't have to do anything. Let me just hold you. Take your time. I love you always and care about you no matter what. I highly recommend this practice, even if it feels inauthentic and even if it requires a great deal of fending off your critic. Keep practicing and eventually you will have a genuine experience of feeling self-compassion for that traumatized child you were, and that you will know that your recovery work has reached a deep level. So that is from Pete Walker's website. I will be reading more and more stuff regarding Pete. I hope you've enjoyed that. This has been a longer MOvember video, but I really wanted to read this piece. We were literally talking in the trauma group the other night about the angering process and people really creating the space for them to anger and screaming in the car and getting that energy moving. And then there was a suggestion made to someone to grab their teddy and lay in the bed and just let the grief flow. And that's a great way to sort of access that, is to just go back to that time. I, like Pete, I do brain spotting, I do radical exposure tapping, I practice TRE, and I still see the absolute necessity that the work needs to be done around the talk therapy and the cognition work. I have not personally found that just doing the body work alone resolves and reprograms and rescripts that inner critic and outer critic. They are two critical, important pieces to recovery. So I hope this has been useful. This was a day 18 video for MOvember, being released on day 19. Being cheeky, I'll make up some more tomorrow. And remember, be gentle with your heart, reach out for support, and I'll see you on the recovery road.